Hey, Vince McMahon, it's time for this week's Stick to Wrestling podcast.
Oh, no, give me a break. Oh, brother.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Stick to Wrestling. My name is John McAdam. It's WrestleMania weekend 2023, and Vince McMahon looks completely ridiculous. Episode of Stick to Wrestling. I don't know if you've seen Vince with all the shoe polish in his hair and that ridiculous mustache, but if you have not, go out of your way to do so. Anyway, Stick to Wrestling is a weekly 60-minute podcast about classic wrestling, usually from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And we are going to do a 1973 episode this week. More on that in a moment. But before I get into that, I want to invite everyone to join our Facebook group. It is a really cool place to discuss pro wrestling. Join it. It's free. Just ask to join. Now, I do this maybe every 6 or 7 weeks. I know there are some people out there who don't like Facebook. I would not be on Facebook if not for the wrestling groups. And I get it if you have not signed up for Facebook. Ryan Ashby, I'm talking to you. You follow me on Twitter. We communicate on Twitter, but you're not on our Facebook page. Ryan, here's what I need you to do. I need you to use me as a mentor, okay? And do what I do. I want you to lie to your family and friends, the closest people to you in your life. I want you to lie to them and tell them, oh, I'm not on Facebook. No, not me. Because, you don't want any part of that. You just want to be part of the Stick to Wrestling podcast group. So that's what I do. And I recommend if you're not on Facebook and you don't want to be on Facebook, that's the reason. Again, just lie to the people that mean the most to you in your life. And with that, I want to thank Vincent Roger, Matthew Hahn, Mike Leslie, and Mark Rock and Rollin for their generous contributions to the Stick to Wrestling podcast. It is ad-free. It is a completely free-to-listen-to podcast. If you want to say thank you, just PayPal us at prowrestlingarchives@gmail.com. No amount is too small, and certainly no amount is too large. With that, I want to bring on our occasional co-host who has a streak going on right now, Steve Gennarelli. Steve, thanks for taking the time and being on Stick to Wrestling.
Hey, John, thanks for the invite. And it's an exciting time to be part of the Facebook group as we just had our draft for the baseball league, the Stick to Wrestling group. And I think the draft went really well. And since a lot of us here are big baseball fans, the season just started. I'm really excited.
I'm excited too, even though I'm a Red Sox fan and we don't have very much to be excited about right now. Well, except for Marcelo Mayer might be coming up this year, and he's one of the best prospects we've had in quite some time. If you're into baseball and you're into me, which you ought to be into both, check out the 605 baseball special that is out right now. It's probably the first half an hour is just me and Brian Last doing nothing but talking baseball and just a little bit of wrestling. So you may want to check that out.
Well, I heard it myself, and I highly recommend it. A lot of great Arcadian Vanguard veterans on there, like Lou Kippelman and Brian Solomon. So I give it 5 stars.
5 stars. That's the max. That's the most you can do. I'm not into this new 7-star thing they got going on. But anyway, all right. So this week on Stick to Wrestling, 50 years ago, an episode of Championship Wrestling from Florida aired. It is available on YouTube. Once again, if you're part of the Facebook page, you can just click the link and we'll bring you to the show. As a matter of fact, I put that on before this episode comes on. But yeah, we're going to review an episode of Championship Wrestling from Florida that aired, Steve, looks like June of 1973.
Yeah, and this is a very interesting time for wrestling in general. I mean, just to kind of give you guys a state of the business at the time, we'll start off with our beloved WWF. Pedro Morales was still in the middle of his championship run, or actually in the final year of his run, and he had successful defenses against Moondog Mayne and Fred Blassie, and during the months that we're talking about here, June of '73. He had just had a 2-match series at the Garden with Don Leo Jonathan. In the AWA, Vern was, of course, in charge. And I did a little research on this. And this is something, I don't know if you would know this, John. I bet you probably did. I was checking to see, who were his major challengers in 1973. And surprisingly, the one that he seemed to face the most was superstar Billy Graham. The other guys that he had major matches with included Nick Bockwinkel and Billy Robinson. But the other thing that surprised me, and you can tell me if you knew about this, he wrestled a lot of enhancement matches, like when they did their TV tapings. And
I did not know that.
Yeah, he'd have matches with Kenny J and George Gadaski, those types of wrestlers, and other local Minneapolis-based prelim wrestlers. And I found that quite interesting, since the WWF never did that back in the day, and the NWA, I'm sure the traveling NWA champion didn't really spend much time wrestling in TV matches unless it hovered around an angle of some sort.
The NWA champion did way more so. Sounds like a lot less than the AWA, but they were on TV. I mean, Race was on Florida TV maybe 2 or 3 times a year, and sometimes it would be just an enhancement match. Like, we want to show you who Harley Race is. WWF, you had the champion on TV, wrestling on TV maybe twice a year. You think that's about right?
Yeah, that's fair to say, I would say.
Yeah, I remember in 1985, Hulk Hogan wrestled Johnny Rodz, and it was the last time we saw Johnny Rodz. And then 1986, so that we all didn't just stop watching wrestling on Memorial Day weekend, he wrestled Bob Orton Jr. on regular TV, which is like, wow, that's was a big giveaway match for 1986.
Yeah. And I think went in there against Rusty Brooks as well, if I remember correctly. That
was when Randy Savage came out and challenged him.
Interesting. And so yeah, I mean, this show, I mean, when you told me that this would be the topic for this week, it really kind of surprised me. 1973 is a little bit older than we normally would do. But when I watched the show, I thought it was very interesting. Gorson Solie is the host. And to me, this show kind of felt like, and some of our older listeners would remember this. If you're fans of the NFL, there used to be a syndicated show every week with Tom Brookshire and Pat Summerall. I think it was called "This Is the NFL" or "This Week in the NFL." And
I think it was "This Is the NFL."
This is the NFL.
I watch that frequently.
Oh, sure. And this show with Gorson Solie really had the same kind of feel to it. I mean, this is a 1-hour show, and if you go to watch it on YouTube, it's like a 40-some-odd minute show with all the commercials taken out. But in this show, there are actually clips of 8 different matches, which is really quite impressive when you think about it.
It was, especially in a 40-minute span, and Gordon, it wasn't all wrestling. Some of it was Gordon doing commentary. Steve, when I was initially watching the show, the first time I watched it twice, I came away saying, okay, what was the point in any of that? And then the second time I watched it, I'm like, oh, okay, they got the individual wrestlers over. They really weren't pushing any storylines. They weren't trying to get you to watch a particular match or a feud, but they got the wrestlers over. They got, and we'll go over them one by one, but second time around, I'm like, okay, I get it.
Well, I think it's interesting as far as, I live here in Tampa now, and my wife grew up in Florida. She grew up in this area. And when she discovered I liked wrestling, was into wrestling, she told me, like, as a young girl in high school, it might be Saturday night, date night. She'd be waiting for her date to come and pick her up. And her dad would be on the sofa watching Gorson Solie and wrestling. And so this was, something that she remembered quite well. And, watching in this show, you have to remember Florida in those days. Florida in 1973, there were no professional sports whatsoever. I think the Cincinnati Reds had a minor league team that played single A ball here. They had
the Dolphins.
There you go. And also we had spring training teams that would come down. I think the Yankees actually worked out of St. Pete for a long time. And but the only really sports in the area, if you were a sports fan, were college sports. So this professional wrestling on a Saturday evening when it aired, this was really big time entertainment for the locals. There wasn't anything else. So I could see why him showing, and these weren't TV squatches that we're watching on this program. These are actual from live events, from like a big, their big city events, highlights of certain matches, or in some cases, most of the match. So why don't you begin, John, with your feelings about the very first match on the show?
Well, I just want to quickly say, I hope Mrs. Gennarelli is not a Florida Gators fan.
Not at all. No.
Okay, good. All right. And going around Florida, the Florida heavyweight champion, depending on when the show aired, it aired sometime in June 1973, but I can't figure out the exact date. And Paul Jones and Buddy Colt were switching the title back and forth. So one of those guys was the Florida champ. Steve, they both wrestled on this show. Do you remember Gordon saying, "Oh, the Florida heavyweight champion"? Because I didn't catch that if he did.
No, I didn't at all. Not at all. No.
All right, that's a little bit weird then. The TV champion is Jack Brisco, and the tag team champions are Roger Kirby and Bob Roop. Kirby was handed one half of the championship after Harley Race walked out. So I don't know what happened there. It's not in Race's book, but the opening match has a gentleman named Tosh Togo, who Gordon pointed out a couple of times was Odd Job in one of the James Bond movies, against a very young babyface, overmatched babyface, Stan Hansen. Now, I looked into this. Stan Hansen has his first career match listed. Now, his first career match listed as January 1st, 1973. However, his next match is listed as March 1973, which makes me think that the January match may not have happened, or the date might be wrong. But this match took place May 8th, 1973. So we're getting Stan Hansen. He's barely even a rookie.
Yeah, it's so good to see this match for a couple of different reasons. I mean, Stan Hansen would go on to have a Hall of Fame wrestling career, but to watch him here in the match, he looks like kind of a taller, lean version of a Greg Valentine. I mean, he's 30 to 40 pounds lighter than he would be in that first WWF run against Bruno a few years later, and he doesn't have the bleached hair and the goatee or anything. He doesn't really look like Stan Hansen that much. But in his work, as far as, you can tell he's a really green guy, because his work punches and his maneuvers were really kind of green looking. And Tosh Togo had been wrestling since like 1949, so he had been in the business about at least 25 years. And it's kind of funny, he was Odd Job in a James Bond movie. And around the time of this particular match, or at least when he was in the Florida territory, Tosh Togo actually filmed a very low-budget film with William Shatner in Tampa. And this movie is called Impulse, and I'm sure it's on YouTube. But he would have quite a career in Hollywood in different B-movies and also in mainstream TV shows. Tosh Togo was in a really famous episode of Gilligan's Island where Rory Calhoun played this guy who wanted to hunt Gilligan, and Gilligan was going to be his prey. It was kind of like a take on was that story, a short story, the Deadliest Game or something like that.
I remember that. Yeah, I read that in high school.
Yeah, and so he'd really been around, and so they have the match, and Togo wins with a stomach claw, which it just kind of seemed kind of a really awkward ending. I mean, he applied it once, and then Hansen kind of rolled into the center of the ring, and they applied it a second time, and they had to stop the match. It was a submission ending, and it was just kind of interesting to see this guy who was in his 50s beat this young, huge guy who was a lot bigger, and just beat him by a submission. It's kind of not what you're expecting to see.
No, I mean, it's right here in my notes. Togo looks old, and he's a huge guy. He's got a huge chest, huge shoulders. And you have to remember, 1973, we are not that far away from World War II, which means that everyone who is Japanese, Russian, or German in wrestling is a heel, no questions asked. Now, somehow the Italians got away with it, Steve, but we're just not that far removed from having those stereotypical characters.
Yes, and I heard Tosh Togo, and the first thing I thought about was Dr. Mabogo from the Addams Family, the doctor that they would call over in Africa sometimes. But he didn't play that role from what I can tell.
Okay. Steve, you mentioned Gilligan's Island. Do you have a favorite episode of Gilligan's Island?
The one that I think is the best is the one I think is their take on Jack and the Beanstalk. Do you remember that one?
I don't. But my favorite was the one where they were almost about to get off the island finally, and Gilligan screwed up and they got stuck on the island. I like that one.
I guess that could have been any of the 80 episodes, really, when you think about it. But now this surprised me, John. Like, so there's that first match, Tosh Togo against Stan Hansen. The second match, like, we really needed this. Tosh Togo versus Hiro Matsuda in a judo jacket match. Where I was stunned. Two matches of the same in a row.
You see, the light went on today. Because when I watched this the first time a few days ago, I watched it, like I said, 2 or 3 days ago, and then I watched it about an hour before we started recording. I'm like, okay, I finally get what they're doing, because they have Togo go over Stan Hansen, and then they have this judo jacket match. They need to explain the rules of this, Steve, because I had no idea what the rules were. I mean, maybe in Florida they had them so often that it's like, explaining the baseball rules over and over again during a baseball game. But we did not get any explanation, and I am still clueless.
As a fan of the newsstand magazines and getting the programs at the matches, the old Norm Keitzer magazines, I do remember, especially in the late 70s, Antonio Inoki had a series of these mixed martial arts matches, and he had at least one or two with Willem Ruska, who I believe was a big judo guy at the time, or karate guy, and they would wear these white jackets and have these matches, and they always look super lame, and the Observer wasn't around back then, but I mean, everything I read about them, they did seem like really lame matches, and it didn't really help Inoki or the promotion that much. But watching this, I mean, yeah, Gorson Solie's announcing does put over Hiro Matsuda, who's like a local legend around here. They put him over big time, and willingly so. That should happen, because he did a lot in this area. But the match itself was definitely like a negative 2 or 3 stars. It was like watching paint dry.
No, it was not a good match. Wilhelm Ruska, and if you're in the Facebook group and you remember this, you have a better memory than I do, please post the information, because back in 77, or I want to say 77, it might have been 76, they had Wilhelm Ruska show up on WWF TV, then WWF TV, doing a judo jacket match. And it was like, it came and went. They had this guy on, they had this special match, and as far as I know, they didn't do anything with it. But you know what, Steve, I get what they were doing, because they show you Tosh Togo beating this big young baby face, and then they have Matsuda beat Togo, and it's like, oh, Togo's good enough to beat that guy, but Matsuda must be really good because he can beat Togo.
Yeah, and he was, went on to train Hogan and trained a lot of wrestlers, and when you watch this show and you hear Gordon's commentary, he really puts over the guys who are involved with The Office, which Matsuda was, and later on in the show, he talks about his boss, Eddie Graham, and says that Eddie Graham is one of the top 10 ranked wrestlers in the country. So you hear a lot of that, commentary, and it makes a lot of sense.
He's old enough to have a kid who wrestles, but he's still in the top 10. They really did a good job putting Matsuda over, because Gordon was talking about how Matsuda was the world junior heavyweight champion, and he never lost the belt. He simply couldn't maintain that low weight.
That was interesting, because that again made it feel like a sport that you're watching. That would be like a boxer not making a certain weight class and he's put into another class. So, in those days, I think the promotions, and this one is a good example, they're trying to show this or portray this exhibition as a sport.
They are, and I think they did a good job with it. The finish was that Matsuda rolled Togo up and pinned him using the jacket, which you're allowed to do. And clearly they were both underneath the ropes, and the referee just, I'm counting to 3.
This, like we say, this match was in 1973. I was thinking about my chronology watching wrestling, and I think like the next time I ever saw like a judo jacket match, and I'm sure you would remember this. It was in 1984. Ken Patera returns to the WWF, and he's wrestling some prelim guy who was like wearing a karate gi or a karate outfit, and just beats the hell out of him. And this guy was just like, he might as well have been a mannequin beaten by Ken Patera.
I do remember that, and I remember he had like a non-squash match guy name. Like, if you're in the squash matches, you're Steve King or you're Frank Williams. This guy had like a fancy name that you're kind of not supposed to have, and it felt like Patera took a disliking to him. I do remember this.
Yeah, he beat him like a dog for sure. Now, the next match was kind of a more main event type match. You have Buddy Colt, who's one of the headliners of the promotion, against grizzled veteran Johnny Walker, who, of course, would become Mr. Wrestling 2.
I remember when I first found out that Mr. Wrestling 2, after watching wrestling for over 10 years and seeing Mr. Wrestling 2 on television and in the magazine, and gosh, who is he? And Mr. Wrestling 2 was a guy I'd never heard of. It's like, oh, he's Rubberman Johnny Walker. I'm like, okay, who is he?
Yeah, and he had been a long time veteran wrestler, and in this match, I mean, if you can imagine this older guy who was mainly kind of a baldish guy with kind of he had a big chest but a kind of a gut on him too.
Yeah.
He's using a lot of knee lifts and using a lot of the same maneuvers that the future Mr. Wrestling 2 would. So you can just imagine him wearing a mask, and you would think, wow, the match is a lot better with him wearing a mask. So.
Yeah, I mean, again, I had never seen Johnny Walker in any of the magazines I had, and I had as many old magazines as I could order, literally, from the old, After magazines, and I didn't know who this guy was. I mean, it's funny, if you're watching this in 1973, you're like, oh man, this guy's career is almost over. He's in semi-retirement at this point, and little did we know it was just the beginning for Johnny Walker.
Yeah, once he got that mask, I mean, he was definitely, on the cover of the After magazines, and back in the 70s, I remember him being on the cover of the magazines, and a lot of the times they would show him like with the peace sign, and I always thought like he was like maybe trying to prove that he's a hip guy, and maybe he's trying to prove that he's younger than he is. But somebody just pointed out to me, no, that just means he's wrestling 2.
Yeah, I mean, to show you what a big star Mr. Wrestling 2 turned into after this. I mean, Steve, tell me if you disagree. I think in like the late 70s, maybe even into 80, before Tommy Rich took over, Mr. Wrestling 2 was the Bruno Sammartino of Georgia.
Yeah, he was extremely popular, and I would say I'd say his career in a lot of ways is very comparable to Chief Jay Strongbow, because
yes,
they both wrestled in Georgia a lot, and they both took this weird career path of wrestling like almost an entire career under their own name or their original name. And in Scarpa's case, he became Chief Jay Strongbow and had a whole entire second career. And the same with Johnny Walker. I mean, he became Mr. Wrestling 2, and that gimmick would continue till the late 80s.
Yeah, I remember getting tapes of Mr. Wrestling 2 when he was in Mid-South in 1984. And by the way, it's on Peacock. The Mr. Wrestling 2 versus, first being Magnum TA's coach and then turning on him and becoming his rival, in my opinion, is the greatest wrestling story ever told. And it is available on Peacock. Start November 1983 and move forward from there. Steve, I think there are two things about this match that were true. Number one, it was very slow moving, but number two, it was a good match nonetheless.
It was a very compelling match. I mean, you really felt like you were watching a competition, a match that had a lot of give and take, and each one would kind of get the lead in the match, and then they would lose it, and would go back and forth. There was some good brawling, there was some good wrestling added in. I had heard rumors, I'm sure you probably heard this too, that Buddy Colt was considered to come up north and wrestle Bruno and be a challenger to Bruno at one point. I don't know why that didn't occur. I know Buddy Colt got in that major accident that ended his career. Maybe that was what happened. Maybe the accident occurred before they could meet up. But
I'm pretty sure that's the case.
Yeah, and I can see in Buddy Colt, why he was really revered, and as I'm sure a lot of the listeners remember, he became one of the commentators on Florida Championship Wrestling and Championship Wrestling from Florida, and he was looked upon as a local legend, but he had kind of a little bit of a Billy Graham vibe and a little bit of a Johnny Valentine vibe, just a kind of a large guy who was, tough in the ring, raw bone in the ring. And Johnny Walker, even though he looked over the hill and had kind of a paunchy look, he was just tenacious. He wasn't going to give up on this match, and he kept fighting for it. And so it was a good old school match.
It was a good old school match. And one reason is because Johnny Walker, during the match, consistently was working on Buddy Colt's arm, and his finisher was a shoulder breaker.
Mm-hmm.
So, it totally made sense. Okay, go for the arm. And there was a spot in the match where Walker, out of nowhere, puts Buddy Colt in a reverse rolling cradle, and the crowd pops like crazy. And it's like 1, 2, and like the crowd's, getting hotter and hotter as they're waiting for that 3 count. And of course, he kicked out. But I mean, just a very different type of wrestling.
Yeah, a good type of wrestling for sure. I mean, they definitely weren't looking into great bodies or, these larger than life characters. It was just good wrestling. And I would say watching Johnny Walker in this phase of his career, I would say he'd be kind of comparable to a Killer Carl Cox, a guy who's balding and, kind of like pudgy, but formidable, and definitely somebody who knows all the key maneuvers to be devastating and to win a match.
Yeah, again, the business has changed so much, and everything has changed so much. It's been 50 years. This weekend, it's as we're recording this, it's WrestleMania weekend. Bret Hart said something that was controversial that, in my opinion, should not have been. He said that wrestling has become too phony, and he pointed out the spot where 10, 15, 20 guys are standing outside the ring, and someone jumps off of something very high and lands on them, and they all go flying around like bowling pins. And hey, that's a fact. That looks ridiculous. The counterpoint to that is, on this show, nothing looked as ridiculous as that, but I don't think anyone could have watched this and been like, oh yeah, this is real competition. None of this is predetermined.
Right. Yeah, I can see Bret's point. I mean, that one spot, I'm not an ardent watcher of AEW, but it seems, I know I listened to the reviews with Jim Cornette and Brian Last, and it seems that those types of spots come up way too frequently on these shows, and I've seen it on WWE too, where they have that obligatory spot where the wrestlers are standing together and get thrown down like bowling pins. But yeah, I mean, to challenge Bret, I mean, there's a lot of good wrestling on WrestleMania last night. WrestleMania, the second half is tonight, and even the ladies match with Charlotte against Rhea Ripley. I mean, that's state of the art. That's outstanding wrestling, and there's a lot of good wrestling out there.
No, there definitely is. That's a spot that I can see, okay, you do it once, and then you put it away forever. And they definitely have not done that, meaning the wrestling business.
Now the next match on our TV card here is Eddie and Mike Graham versus the Interns, and this match again, and this which kind of made this show so cool. These weren't just Florida matches. This particular one was from the Omni in Atlanta. So what did you think about this matchup?
I thought they kept the match, or they kept the match itself kind of short, or at least what they showed us was kind of short. They made a big deal about the brand new Omni Center in Atlanta, Georgia, making it sound like, it was I'm sure it was for 1983, 1973. How many times are we going to make that mistake? A state-of-the-art arena, which again, I'm sure it was for the time. I absolutely loved the interns gimmick. I think it's hilarious. Two guys, you go into a hospital, you see the interns dressed up in these bright white costumes, or at least you used to, and that's what the interns had here. The white masks, the white tops, and the white trunks. I thought it was hilarious. I always did.
I guess the medics weren't available.
Yeah, really? Yeah, they're out in California. We have interns out here.
But yeah, it was ludicrous. I mean, just to see these two buffoons in their outfits, and Eddie Graham, he had a lot of fire. He definitely looked over the hill, but he'd been wrestling. I mean, he wrestled in New York in main events in the 50s, and Mike Graham is still very, very new to the business, probably in his second year of wrestling, I would think. But they did a fine job. I mean, this is more or less almost like a squash match with them going over and doing all the tag team spots, like getting both of their opponents in the figure four or in a spinning toe hold or something to end the match. But it was good to put them over, since this is basically their program.
Yeah, I think Mike Graham started in 1972, so he's very fresh here. I mean, what they showed was good. They finished them off. The Grahams finished the interns off with a double figure four leg lock, which the ref just let go, which is fine. And now you've got me thinking about the medics, Dr. Ken Ramey and the medics. It sounds like they should be playing CBGB in 1979 or something.
Yeah, they could have been the opening act for NRBQ.
There you go. We managed by Captain Lou Alberto. Steve, why is it that, and it's been 20 years now, why is it that Mike Graham is so unpopular / disliked amongst the internet wrestling community? I have always been a big fan of Mike Graham. I don't get the heat, as the kids say.
I think what it is, I mean, this is just my take on it. I just think that when he used to do those old roundtable WWF shows where they would talk about a certain historical topic, and also all the number of shoot interviews he did with Sean Oliver and different people, I mean, he always just came off as either a complete know-it-all, I was the one that put together the NWO gimmick, and all these.
Did he really say that?
I'm sure he did at one point. I'm sure he did. It seems like they all say that at one point, but he just comes off so braggadocio, and and he says if I had a minute with Kevin Nash, I could beat him up, and maybe he could have. I mean, I don't know.
He could have.
I mean, he was tough as nails, and he was a power lifter. I mean, yes, he was a short guy, but it just seemed like he had this major Napoleon complex going on, and he just turned off a lot of people. I don't know, but
all right. I mean, maybe, you know what, the roundtables are available on Peacock if anyone wants to check them out. I've seen them. My reaction, I was surprised by other people's reaction to Mike Graham because I enjoyed him on these roundtables. Steve, would you like to hear a really cool Mike Graham story? I am 100% sure that 90% of this story is correct.
I would love to hear it.
They're at the NWA guys. This is late 91 or at an airport, I think in Atlanta, hanging out, and Sid shows up. Sid is now with the WWF, and Sid starts, putting down everything about the NWA and the wrestlers and etc. And he starts in with Brian Pillman, and he's like, WWF would never take you. You're too small. And Pillman's arm is in a sling. Now, I'm taking Pillman anyway against Sid. But Mike Graham gets up and he's like, hey, my arm's not in a sling. If you want to fight someone, fight me. Well, Sid points out that he's got a bandage on his arm or something like that. Mm-hmm. And Mike Graham flips out. He takes off his belt. He ties his arm behind his back. He's like, I'll fight you with one arm tied behind my back. Oh, come on, let's go. And Sid's like, I got to catch my flight.
That is a good story.
Yeah, but I'll bet Mike Graham, I'll say this about, Sid. I'll bet Mike Graham could have taken on Sid with his arm tied behind his back. And I'll bet Mike Graham could take on 5 of me with his arm tied behind his back. So this isn't just me going after Sid. It's like Mike had a rep in the business. You didn't mess around with Mike Graham.
Well, I think the thing that I think he was so proud of, and I give him credit for this, he grew up in the business. He grew up surrounded by, I'm sure in school, kids telling him your dad's a fake, wrestling is fake, you're a piece of garbage, what have you. He probably had to put up a lot of that in his life, that kind of disrespect to the wrestling business. Meanwhile, it's the business that feeds his family and puts food on the table. So I can see why he'd be so defensive, and
Sure.
he grew up old school. I mean, he grew up defending the business and defending the wrestlers, because he knew how hard they worked and how good they were and how tough they were. Because back in those days, I mean, a lot of the wrestlers were really tough guys. They weren't like showy models like they are now. So.
I mean, I always liked Mike Graham. When I got Florida Championship Wrestling on cable back in 1980, 1981, they had me convinced that he had a real shot at becoming the next NWA champion, which is nothing but good promoting. And I met Mike Graham in 1991 in Philadelphia, and I thought he was a great guy. I mean, he was, he had no problem just, taking the time to talk shop with me. And, I was respectful. I said, I remember the match you had against Dory Funk Jr. on Florida TV in 1981 was one of the best matches I'd ever seen. And he was, he was very grateful that I remembered it and that I had a high opinion on it. So again, of course I'm going to like Mike after that, but I liked him way before that.
Yeah, I met him briefly at the Wrestle Reunion in Tampa, and he was just standing at a table all by himself. And I went over, and at the time in Tampa on the local TV, they were airing old Florida matches, CWF matches, like late at night. And him and Randy Savage,
yeah.
They would do the wraparounds on him. And so I walked up to him and I said, "Where's your tag team partner today?" Randy Savage, and he said, "Oh, he must be fishing or something like that." And but he couldn't have been a nicer guy. I mean, he was just really nice. And actually another guy who was just as nice who was there that day was Dustin Rhodes, Dusty's son. He was so nice. It was funny because Dusty was there that day and he was a complete ass, and it was just funny to meet his son who was so genuine and so nice. So it was interesting.
That was funny. One of our earliest Stick to Wrestlings was about me charming Dusty Rhodes into getting a picture of me taken with him. Someone told me, "Oh, you'll never get a picture with Dusty. He doesn't take pictures." I was like, "Yeah, okay, you just threw down the gauntlet, pal. I'm getting my picture taken with Dusty Rhodes."
And you got it.
And I got it.
Cool.
Anyway, where was we on this? Oh, now we got a big match between two guys who are not Hall of Famers, but they're the next level down.
Yeah, it's actually a lights out match, which means anything goes. Dick Murdoch in his street clothes, he really wore his wrestling gear, it looks like, and Paul Jones in his street clothes, he's wearing like dress slacks and cowboy boots, and it just it was really good. I mean, you have a smaller guy, Paul Jones, who was a big star in Florida and the Carolinas, against the rugged cowboy Dick Murdoch, who was a lot larger. But Paul Jones's punches and brawling were outstanding. And when I watched this, and maybe you can answer this question, one thing that kept coming up in my mind is, how did Paul Jones, who was so revered in the Carolinas and so revered in Florida, who made the decision to make him this buffoonish manager in Crockett in the mid '80s? I mean, why did that have to happen?
I don't know. My understanding, and in a way, it's sad that is what Paul Jones absolutely is best remembered for, being on national cable television as this buffoonish manager. And I think part of it was that he just wasn't good in that role. He really wasn't. It was just that Crockett, from everything I've heard, Crockett liked him and wanted to keep him employed, and Jones had a bad back, so they made him a manager. But he was never a good manager. Like, even before they got on WTBS, like when they were just doing, when he was just on Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, he was bad.
Yeah, I'm just stunned. I mean, he, from the magazines, and I know you've said this before, like you said, you would never be surprised if you bought a magazine that he was the new NWA champion, because he was so over wherever he went. And I know in the late '80s, before JCP sold out to Turner, that there was sometimes called Johnny Weaver the living legend, or the legend of the show. And I'm sure in the Carolinas he was a legend, but I kind of wish that they had put the moniker on Paul Jones, because he could have been that good elder statement wrestler, and maybe a guy who only wrestled part time. He had a nice look. He was smaller, but he had a really good look, and it's a shame that they gave him that heel manager role.
Yeah, I think it was just that there was nothing else they could do with him. But even, before he was putting on the tuxedo, or even before, even before he was putting on like the prom tuxedo and the big cowboy hat, and then he switched that ridiculous, I mean, what else can I call it? It's a Hitler outfit. I don't know what else to call it. But, the whole time it was just a bad spot for him. But I mean, he was a really, like you said, he was a really good wrestler. And I have said this, in 1978, 1979, if I had opened up a magazine and said, Paul Jones is the new heavyweight champion after defeating Harley Race, I would not have been surprised. That's how good he was. That's how over he was.
Well, I know Barry Rose is a big fan of his. And from what I heard, Barry Rose was going to write the bio of Paul Jones. So in the future, I think he'll be a future guest someday on Stick to Wrestling. Maybe we could dive into that a little bit more, because I'm sure Barry has the intel on what really happened.
Yeah, Barry was supposed to be on maybe a month ago, and he just mentioned in passing that, I'm moving this week. And I'm like, well, Barry, we can do it some other time. I want you to have to take time out of your schedule when you're in the middle of a move. But yeah, we're going to have Barry on in the very near future. We love Barry to death. This was, one cool thing about this match. They come out, Dick Murdoch's the heel, and that's what I was wondering coming in. Like, okay, who's the heel here? Who's the baby face? And not even 60 seconds in, these guys established it. It's like Dick Murdoch is all scared because Paul Jones is wearing cowboy boots and he has one of his fists taped up, and he's being all heelish about it. Dick Murdoch, in my opinion, Steve, he's one of those guys who he was an okay babyface, but I always thought he was way, way better as a heel.
Yeah, and the thing I liked about Murdoch, too, is even later in his career, I mean, he garnered a lot of respect. I remember there was an angle in the UWF, I think in '86, where Ted DiBiase was still there, and they brought Murdoch in to do something with him on the heel side. And it just felt like Dick Murdoch was this, veteran free agent that they just plucked off the waiver wire, and he just came in and he was like an all-star. There's nothing he couldn't do, and he had a legendary reputation. So he went from like being not even on the roster to being right in the main event mix almost immediately.
Yeah, I remember he showed up in JCP like fall of 1986, and it was the first time I got well, no, not really. It's the first time I got a long look at him, because I saw him when he was in Florida in 1980, and once again, he was just a bland babyface in my opinion, and then he turns on Barry Windham in the middle of a match, and the next week he's a heel with Lord Alfred Hayes, and he just had a lot more fire, and he was a way more interesting character. I mean, I've said it on this show before. He had a run of about 4 weeks in early 1988 with Jim Cornette as his manager, and the guy was a tornado. It was like, okay, you've got a pay-per-view main eventer right here, and then he went back to Japan, came back, he's with Paul Jones, and he's boring again.
Last week we were really more than busting on Dusty Rhodes and the end of his booking era in Jim Crockett Promotions. But what you just said really resonated. I mean, they could have put the Outlaws back together again. In fact, they did that very briefly for that run in Detroit. They did a night where the Sheik came back and teamed with I think the Sheik teamed with Kevin Sullivan against the Outlaws, Dusty and Murdoch, and they actually popped the house. I think they had the biggest box office of any of the Great American Bash shows in '88, and they were going to do it again. And the Sheik wanted more money, and they didn't run the second show. But that would have been maybe the perfect spot for Dusty, who wanted to keep doing his thing, but maybe, get him in this like kind of retro team with Murdoch, and I bet you they could have pulled that off.
I mean, look, it was a virtual certainty that Dusty was going to get the job as the booker, and then he blew it, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And he quickly found himself outside of the promotion. And to Dusty's credit, he went to the WWF, which is something we did not see coming. And then moving further down the road, he was a main eventer in the WWF, which I absolutely did not see coming. I thought, Vince gave him a little bit of an embarrassing gimmick, and that was done on purpose, but at the same time, he got over, and they didn't push him down our throats. I can't say that. And he had a main event series against Randy Savage that drew really well. And then before that, the series with Big Boss Man drew well. So I give Dusty all the credit in the world. And then the Ted DiBiase feud did well.
Yeah. I mean, Dusty could get himself over really at any point. I mean, if you remember the very last dying days of WCW, I think the last two episodes that they ran on TNT, actually, Dusty and Flair were like the top stars of the promotion again. Everything had come full circle. I mean, it was unbelievable.
I think they did that on purpose. They knew that the promotion was not going to be around at all in the next 2 weeks. So let's just have two going away shows, and one of them was Ric Flair wrestling in a T-shirt against Sting.
That was embarrassing.
That was pretty bad. But all right, so this was a good match. Let me see. Paul Jones, I never understood this. We've talked about this on the show, but we haven't in years. In 1980, he came back to Florida under a mask as Mr. Florida, and it couldn't have been more obvious who it was. But I never understood it. It's like, okay, you can have a big name in Paul Jones who has a long history of being a pro wrestling star in Florida, but instead you put him under the mask, which you could do with anybody. It made no sense to me.
But didn't they do a similar angle with Morocco where he was like the Magnificent M or something like that?
They did, but he got quickly unmasked, and that was his heel turn.
Right.
He was a babyface before that, and that kind of explained everything. He comes out, he's got his head shaved, and he's talking about how he could be the next Jack Brisco, but he wasn't friends with the promotion, so he was going to go this. He was going to be Mr. M. That's who he was.
Mr. M. That's right.
And then 3 years later, on Georgia TV, he was Dr. X for a few weeks. So I don't know why Morocco just enjoyed doing that sometimes.
Well, our next match on this show was actually a battle royal, and this was kind of interesting. As it worked out on the show, Gorgeous George Jr. actually dumped out Ron Fuller to win the 19-man battle royal, and he won the prize of $6,012. So, what are your thoughts on that battle royal?
Well, the first thing on my screen, big bold letters, Battle Royal, and then it says $6,012. So I'm glad I didn't just imagine that twice. I'm like, why? We better throw another $12 in here. I mean, I thought they did. Battle Royals usually stink. This was a good 4 or 5 minutes of television. They did a good job editing, and plus the guys in the match kept it moving. So I give them credit. This was enjoyable battle royal watching for me.
What I think really set this one apart compared to the ones that you and I have discussed, like you mentioned some that happened in Boston where it was the first card of the night and then the promoters had to scramble to put together matches. Well, this worked out a little bit better because you could tell just from the limited action that we saw that some of these guys, Ron Fuller specifically, he had been involved in kind of a big angle or big getting bloodied up on the show earlier. So he comes out like the Spirit of 76, all wrapped up with the tape on his head, and he's just like throwing these tremendous work punches, but he looks like a really great worker in there. And so there was actually some storyline that you could tell from something that happened earlier in the card, and it made a lot of sense.
Yeah, what happened was he got bloodied up by the Samoans, and not Afa and Sika, but the Tia and Tapu Samoans, who were two kind of smallish guys managed by someone named Dandy Jack. It just kind of takes me back to like that old Eddie Murphy thing where it's like, no, my name's Buckwheat. No, not Wheat is not my last name. Just Buckwheat's my name. Like my Dandy Jack. No, Jack is not my last name. My name is just Dandy Jack. I never liked stuff like that. It should be Dandy Jack Johnson or anything you got. But yeah, I mean, Fuller looked absolutely great here. He's a legit, really tall guy. He's a bit on the thin side, but 6'9" doesn't always fill out the way 6'1" does. And I mean, really, I looked at this. I'm like, why wasn't Ron Fuller a bigger star? He could have come up here and challenged either Bruno or Backlund and then had a big series against Andre. And I know people are going to say, well, he liked to stay close to home, but there's nothing wrong with going on the road and making some big money.
Well, I know when we had Todd on a few weeks ago, and Todd gave us that great episode about Mid-Atlantic wrestling in the Carolinas, he mentioned that at one point Ron Fuller was under serious consideration to becoming the next NWA champion. While I respect his opinion greatly, I think just the fact that Ron Fuller was 6'9" really kind of disqualified him. As they probably want if Ron Fuller had been say 5'9" to maybe about 6'2" or 6'3", I'm sure he would have been in that conversation. But he had a good career. I mean, went to Japan and went all over, and of course he's intrinsically linked to the promotion in Pensacola, the Fuller's promotion. So.
I've never understood that, and not challenging you, Steve. Just I'm interested in your point of view. Like I would say something like, okay, who besides Ric Flair, who would be the top 10 guys to be the NWA champion? And if you ask me that, always on that list would be both Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen. And people are like, nope, they're too big. I'm like, so what? Like, why are they too big? What's wrong with, okay, Bruiser Brody is this really big, intimidating guy, or Stan Hansen, and he's the NWA champion, and your local babyface, whether it be Dusty Rhodes or Kerry Von Erich, has to overcome this. Like a lot of people have said this. I've never been able to put that together.
Well, I think Vince Jr. was the one that really, broke away from that thinking that I'm talking about. He felt having Hogan as champ was perfect, and it worked. I mean, that really took wrestling into a new era. I guess what I'm saying is kind of based on the thought process of the old NWA promoters. I mean, look at the guys they did pick. I mean, you have Dory, you have Brisco, you have Harley Race, Ric Flair. They're all maybe about the same size. They're all about the same weight. I mean, there's no real standout. Even there isn't even a Barry Windham in there. Like they're all about the same size. So I don't think that they were trying to change or rock the boat, so to speak, with a different looking champion.
No, I can see that. I mean, you want to stick with what works, so I can definitely see that. I just, couldn't see the idea of a Hansen or a Brody being disqualified from consideration. And if you think about it, wrestling is kind of that David and Goliath thing.
Right.
That's why most big guys are heels, or at least at one point were heels, because, you had that David versus Goliath story. And like, to me, Hulk Hogan, it worked. There were times where I sat and wondered, gee, why is this working? Because I would think, Greg Valentine, can he beat Bob Backlund? Absolutely. Can Bob Backlund beat Hulk Hogan? Sure. David versus Goliath. Can Greg Valentine beat Hulk Hogan? Absolutely not. But it didn't matter. People went to buy tickets to see the smaller heel get beaten up by big Hulk Hogan.
Yeah, they definitely changed the way the business went when WWF did that change. Now, another match on this card, this of all the ones that we've talked about and the ones that are left, this is probably the one that they showed the very least footage of. Tony Charles versus Big Jim Brooks, who apparently is the cousin of Dick Murdoch.
I did not know that. It's right here in my notes. Before I saw this tape in the, this was floating around back in the 80s. I've seen this before, but like before I got this, I had never even heard of Big Jim Brooks, and now I know that he's Dick Murdoch's cousin because I had no idea 60 seconds ago.
And Tony Charles, for the fans that didn't know, I know Jim Cornette has mentioned him a lot on the podcast over the years. Just a guy who was kind of like your Dean Malenko of the 70s. Maybe he's just somebody who had all the holds and had all these different maneuvers and great flexibility and brought a European style of wrestling. And it's a shame, really, on this tape that we only get to see him for probably less than a minute.
No, he was an excellent worker. I mean, anytime, you have the chance to see a Tony Charles match, I recommend you do so because he was really good. And you're right. I wish we could have seen more of him here. He had a son who about 40 years ago got a scholarship offer to play football at Alabama, and something happened. He got sick and he wound up not doing it. But certainly, we all know how good you have to be to play that level of college football. And so, just obviously there's some great athleticism running through that family.
Oh, yeah. He was definitely a standout. And then the next match, and I guess it's probably the last one of the show, Jack Brisco against Bobby Shane in the main event of the Hour of Wrestling.
Two huge stars from that era. This is about a year before, not even a year before, Jack Brisco won the NWA championship, and he was seen as a rising star, almost like that was, I don't want to say a foregone conclusion, but you would think in 1973 Jack Brisco was going to be a future NWA champion, and you didn't have to wait much longer.
Yeah, according to the record I'm looking at, Harley Race did beat Dory Funk on May 24th in Kansas City, Kansas. Harley's close to Harley's home. And then Jack won the title on July 20th of 73 in Houston, Texas. And
okay, so the next month.
Yeah, the next month. And in fact, when I watched this, I was kind of under the assumption that Jack Brisco was the champion at the time, but it was just like a month or so prior, I guess.
Yeah, Jack Brisco was billed here as the Florida television champion. I don't really have a perspective on how big a belt that was, but here's something I miss about wrestling, Steve. And this started going away, over 40 years ago when I noticed that Georgia Championship Wrestling, they used to have a Georgia heavyweight champion. Here's the Georgia heavyweight champion, Tommy Rich, and I liked that. I liked it when they had a Florida heavyweight champion. Now, in world class, their biggest champion was the Texas heavyweight champion. Mm-hmm. And early 80s, that all went away. The Georgia champion became the national heavyweight champion. The Florida kept putting different championships out there that were bigger than the Florida championship, whether it be the Southern championship, the international championship, the North American championship. World class went to the American heavyweight champion, but I miss state titles.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And I do know as a magazine reader, the Missouri State title seemed to be the biggest of them all as far as the most important, and seemed like the Missouri State title was the one that would take you to the NWA championship at some point. But Jack Brisco here, he's definitely in his prime. He just has this, he has that aura of a champion. He is a great amateur wrestler, as most probably know, but his brawling is very good. But he just has this tremendous look. I mean, he looks like a completely polished, completely professional championship wrestler. And I can see why it was fairly easy for the NWA promoters to give it the green light and say, this is the guy that we want to build around. And he would end up having a good three-year run or so.
He was only champion for about 2 years, maybe about 2.5. And I know Jack just got tired of the schedule. But Jack Brisco, I remember getting Florida Championship Wrestling in 1980 and seeing him for the first time. Now, 1980, he's past prime. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I watched the guy wrestle, and I was like, oh my God, this guy is so good at what he's doing.
Yeah, he was just so polished in the ring, and just, there wasn't anything he couldn't do, and he just looked like a champion. I mean, he looked like the kind of a guy you could have put out with Howard Cosell or one of the top announcers, and it really made wrestling feel like it was a big time thing. And I think he definitely stands up along with Bruno and Vern and the Funks, Dory and Harley. I mean, they're all great champions in their own way, but there was something special about Brisco. And I know, later on when they had to pick Backlund to be the next long-term WWF champion, they really wanted Backlund to be kind of patterned after Brisco. And I think had there not been a Brisco, there probably wouldn't have been a Backlund as champion.
That's a really good point. As a matter of fact, if it's 1976 and then Bruno Sammartino is like, "Look, get this belt off me. I've had it." I really would have. I would have flown Jack Brisco up to New York and had a long talk with him, and I said, "Look, I know not long ago you told the NWA, look, I want out of this schedule. Our schedule is nothing like that schedule. I'm not saying it's not a pro wrestler schedule, but it's not NWA champion schedule." And I think Jack Brisco would have been absolutely fantastic in Backlund's role. Not that Backlund wasn't, but Brisco. I mean, if I'm in Vince McMahon Sr.'s place in 1976, the first call I would have made would have been to Jack Brisco.
Yeah, I think he would have been great if he had been willing and his health was good enough. I think he would have done a great job with it. Bobby Shane is a guy that is sadly forgotten by a lot of people. You could tell he was very animated in the ring, had a really, for its time, very outlandish ring gear, and
yes.
he was really quite the character. And from different things I've read, people have speculated that had he lived, he would have been a major player in the 80s, maybe not so much as an active wrestler, but they thought he would have been either a top booker or, played a major role in the wrestling game in the 80s.
Yeah, it's a shame. As many of us know, Bobby Shane died in an airplane crash, which just happened way too often for entertainers in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I think Bobby Shane, he was a little bit on the small side, not terribly small, but I mean, clearly he would have had a big career in wrestling. And like you said, I have heard that he was a very creative guy and would have been around in the business even after his in-ring career had expired.
Oh, yeah. And, earlier in the show, we did mention the Gilligan's Island, and I think it's only fair to say that Dory Funk's reign as NWA champion, Dory's reign began in February of '69, maybe about 6 or 7 months before the debut of the Brady Bunch, and his reign ended in May of '73, about a year prior to the end of the Brady Bunch. So I just want to put that into perspective for the fans at home.
I'm sure there's a connection there someplace. It's like, Jack's like, look, I'm tired of being on the road, missing the Brady Bunch, and I'm going to Florida to watch the reruns. That's another thing, too. Like, that's another thing you would have had to talk Jack Brisco into, is that, we have long winters up here in the Northeast. And I know that Jack was not a fan of that. So that's another thing you would have had to overcome. But I still maintain that had they been able to get Jack Brisco as WWF champion, he would have been magnificent in the role.
Well, I think we did a good job recapping this entire episode. Do we have time for like one final question or a comment?
I mean, not really, Steve. If you got something you want to throw out there, I think we've done a good job this week.
All right, I'll save that for next time.
Okay. All right. So, Steve, I want to thank you for being our guest co-host, our usual co-host on Stick to Wrestling. Thank you for taking the time.
No, it's great. It was really fun to revisit part of wrestling I'm not too familiar with, 1973 Florida.
If it's before my time, it is ancient. I barely remember anything about 1973 that does not involve the New York Mets. All right, I want to thank Brian Lass for giving me this opportunity, this forum. I want to thank Lou Kippelman for all the great work he does producing Stick to Wrestling. And this has been a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network. We'll see you next week.
This concludes our podcast day.